Before I begin, I want to emphasize that I'm doing this kind of market update because understanding the Federal Reserve policies and the macro is the most important aspect to consider when investing. Without these updates and knowledge, whatever you invest in, it is highly likely that you will not succeed, and even if you succeed, you'll not learn much because you'll have no idea why you succeeded. So, although this may be boring stuff, please watch the clip till the end and try to listen carefully and understand the logics and technicalities behind it. Okay, on January 18th, 2025, I uploaded a video saying that I was observing the dumbest market I've ever seen, given the market was rising at the start of the year, despite the negative data that was coming out. I gave 3 reasons why the market was dumb for going up at the start of the year. Number 1, market was down for some time towards the end of 2024, and therefore, the recovery in 2025 was natural to happen, given the market generally bounces back after some time of a downfall, and so it's nothing to be happy about. And number 2, the most important component of the CPI is the shelter, and I didn't see any signs of shelter price going down, which means that a more downward trend is highly likely. And number 3, retail sales underperforming the expectations will not contribute to the interest rate going down, given the expectations were stretched based off the strong trend coming out of COVID. The message I was trying to make clear was that, number 1, the market was so dumb to expect a rally just because Trump is re-elected and he'll go full force in pulling the market up. And number 2, the market was even more dumb to expect the interest rate will go down in the near term just because Trump was shouting for a more liquid market. And number 3, the market was the dumbest for still chasing after classic growth stocks even when the data was strongly indicating the opposite. I said this multiple times, so I won't go into further details. Now, following the video in January, I uploaded a video on February 18th laying out 3 different scenarios which may happen in the market. Today, I want to go over the 3 scenarios again and see where we are headed. The first scenario was ignore inflation scenario, where Trump just blamed the inflation on the former president and just does what he does all the time by lowering the interest rate as soon as possible and providing more liquidity in the market to jack up the stock market. Now, as I say all the time, I don't think Trump is a dumb guy, and I'm very certain that he realizes the consequences of a high inflation. Now, as I said in my previous videos, that under this scenario, the impact will most likely be neutral to the US, while being a disaster for the rest of the world. However, the reason I said it'll be neutral to the US and not good for the US is because under this scenario, what do you think will happen to the US? I mean, one obvious thing that'll happen is that the US dollar will be stronger than ever. Now, do you think this is good for the US? No, this is bad for the US, given strong dollar means that other countries in the world will feel a much bigger burden to purchase US products. Whatever the product is, whether it's Apple, Nvidia, Tesla, or whatever, it'll most likely be more expensive to purchase those US products in their currency, so US exports will face a catastrophe. Now, the domestic consumption will still most likely be good for the US, given its economy will be sustained. But what I'm trying to say is that because these are negative consequences for the US, it'll be challenging for Trump to go full force with lowering the interest rate, as he would well understand the consequences. Now, going back to the scenario 1, we can certainly see that Trump is not ignoring the inflation. He's pretty much doing what he can to fight the inflation. For example, his implementation of Doge with Elon Musk to cut costs and control the hot job market, and also his efforts to increase the oil supply to decrease the commodity cost. However, this is obviously not enough. This is why 3 days ago, Jerome Powell proudly came up saying that the Fed will wait as long as it takes to see how Trump's aggressive policy actions play out before making any decisions on the interest rate. The job market also added 151,000 non-farm payrolls in February, which was slightly below expectations. But Powell also commented that the labor market is solid and broadly in balance. He also said that wages are growing fast than inflation and at a sustainable pace than earlier in the pandemic recovery. Okay, so the conclusion I'll make today is that scenario 1 is now dead. There's really no chance of Trump ignoring the inflation based on what he has been saying and doing so far. And I would say that he's very wary of the situation. After all, this was the lowest likelihood scenario anyways. Only way to get out of this mess is for the March CPI data, which is coming out very soon, to be much better than expectations, but we'll need to see how it spans out. Now, the second scenario was fake blaming the Fed scenario. Basically, this scenario was Trump shouting out for a low interest rate, but behind the scene, telling the Fed to do what they need to do to cool down the inflation. I said that Trump can achieve three things by doing this, which is number one, he'll be keeping his promises of implementing the tariff. And number two, he'll look like he cares about people's investments and 401k. And number three, by doing so, he can maintain his popularity. I also said that the scenario will be bad not only for the US markets, but for the rest of the world as well, given it means that the market will not have much liquidity for the mid to long term, while tariffs will be implemented. The less liquidity and more tariff combined together is really bad for the market, given it means that interest rate will remain high to bring the inflation down. But tariffs will pressure the inflation to go higher, which will be then pressuring the interest rate to go even higher. So we fall into this kind of a vicious cycle where we fall into a never-ending inflation trap, which we cannot escape. Now, on this scenario, I don't know if Trump is having a side conversation with the Fed, but they're surely sending conflicting messages. And to be honest, I feel like Trump's pressure towards the Fed has also kind of cooled down a little bit. He's also trying to find solutions himself to cool down inflation. And so, while I don't know whether Trump is having the side conversation with the Fed, I would say that the current market looks quite similar to scenario 2. And this is why the market dropped so much, especially the growth stocks, which can only survive under a high liquidity environment. So I'll say that scenario 2 is still valid and ongoing. Thus, we need to be careful when approaching the market. Now, moving on to scenario 3, this was the fake the tariff scenario, where Trump acts like he'll implement a huge tariff, but doesn't actually do so to keep the stock market positive. Now, situational update is, in February, Trump announced a 10% tariff on China and 25% tariff on goods from Mexico and Canada. From Mexico and Canada, he announced a 1-month delay, but the 1 month has lapsed, and the tariffs actually went into effect shortly after. However, after that, Canada also announced a retaliatory tariff, saying that they'll cut off all the electricity exports, which led Trump to announce that a subset of goods covered in the US, Canada, Mexico agreements will be exempted from the tariffs. Now, those goods cover around 38% of imports from Canada and around 50% of goods from Mexico. So as you can see, Trump is somewhat kind of implementing the tariffs here and there, but it's nowhere near the level he preluded prior to his presidency, and he's also continuing to give leeways to the countries depending on the circumstances. Trump also did set up a thing called a ERS, which stands for External Revenue Services, which assesses potential tariff implementation on all the counterparty countries. So Trump is somewhat showing his willingness to do all the tariff-related things, but when things actually happen, it makes the market wonder whether he is actually going full force with it. Now, the reason we feel that way is because of the same reasons we laid out above. Trump is extremely worried about the strong dollar and inflation, that he can't go full force with anything. You can only do that when the inflation is low and dollar is controlled so that there's no impact on the US economy. But right now, things are the opposite, and Trump has too much stuff to care about. So I think the scenario 3 is somewhat still valid, but in a different way. I think deep in Trump's mind, he wants to go full force with the tariffs, but he can't do that because of circumstantial issues. And therefore, while Trump is not faking it, the outcome is somewhat similar due to what's been going on. So the conclusion on the latest market is simple. Number one, unless the March CPI data really turns around, the market will likely continue to suffer, with the growth stocks suffering the most due to inflation. And number two, the strong dollar and high inflation will continue to limit Trump's ability to implement the tariff. And number three, with all the uncertainties ahead, flight to safety mentality may drain the money in the stock market more and more. Now, I would say that 1 and 3 are negative to the stock market, while 2 is neutral to the stock market. So my conclusion still holds the same. The Federal Reserve chessboard is still shifting towards low liquidity case, and under this environment, we need to be extra careful and sit on the sideline and monitor the market, especially the CPI, to get a sense of what will happen next. I'll be back with more market updates very soon.